The ruling didn't go in your favor, but I think Gorsuch's dissent with Justice Jackson is really interesting.
Yeah, we absolutely agree with what he said. Look, the COVID policy was put in place as a temporary measure. It's long outlived any public health justification. CDC has said that. And in fact, the states went to the Supreme Court and didn't even argue that this was necessary for COVID, just as a border management tool. And I think Justice Gorsuch was absolutely right. If you want to talk about revising the asylum policies at the border, then we can talk about that. And we are in favor of putting in a fair and efficient system. But you can't continue to misuse these public health laws.
So what's the next step here?
Well, the next step is we'll go to the Supreme Court. We're hopeful that we'll win, but ultimately the merits of Title 42 will not be there. And so at some point, this needs to end. I mean, I think what people miss are two things. One is that it gives people no asylum hearing whatsoever. You see a lot of the red states say, well, look, you can just apply for asylum legally. Title 42 does not allow you to get asylum hearing, even if you present yourself legally at a port of entry. The other point is that this is not some technical abstract policy. There is real harm going on. Mothers and fathers are being pushed back across the bridge into Mexico, holding their little children's hands directly into the hands of cartels. The Federal Court of Appeals said it's like walking the plank. There are thousands of cases, documented cases, of rape, torture, persecution, even death. I mean, this is horrific what's happening, and there's no longer any public health justification. If you want to debate border management policy, let's debate that, but let's not misuse a public health law, as Justice Gorsuch said.
Well, and he also makes the point that it's an accurate point that Congress hasn't done its job to address this since comprehensive immigration reform, I think 1986, the last big one.
Right.
It got through under the Reagan administration. I do want your response though, to what the Republican-led states are saying here, 19 of them who have prevailed for now.
Right.
Quote, the greatly increased number of migrants resulting from this termination will necessarily increase states' law enforcement, education, and healthcare costs. They're saying we can't bear the cost of this. How do you think you prevail then when the court hears this out more fully?
Well, I think ultimately what the court will hopefully say is what Justice Gorsuch said. If you want to talk about border management, let's talk about that. If there are policies that deal directly with border management, we'll address those, address the legality of them, and also from a public policy measure. But you can't misuse a public health law. It was not intended to regulate the border. I also think people are overstating what's happening at the border. If you close the border for so long, of course there's going to be a temporary influx of people, but ultimately it'll even out. And the federal government has more than enough resources to deal with this.
But do you think they're prepared for it? If they have the resources, do they have a plan to actually use it when this is no longer?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think they do have a plan, but ultimately I think Title 42 is acting as a crutch, and once it goes, they will then have to surge those resources. What we saw with the Ukrainians, which was great, is them surging resources, processing 100,000 people. We can do this. It's sort of a will, where there's a will, there's a way kind of thing. And I think there's no question they can do it. And I think the NGOs and other states around the country are prepared to help. But we can't have a system where there's zero asylum. And
Lee, your position is clear. I mean, you are obviously not in support of Title 42 remaining, which means that people seeking asylum can just get rejected and pushed back into Mexico. But what do you make of the Biden administration that initially, during the campaign in the early days, was all about repealing it, then changed when many more migrants were coming over the border and wanted it, and now back? Yeah,
I mean, we're happy that the Biden administration was on our side in this battle, but ultimately the Biden administration has not been great on the border, and that's troubling. I think at the end of the day, we have to have some asylum system. Unless you're in favor of no one getting asylum, no matter how much danger they're in, even if the persecution is racial, religious, political, you can't keep Title 42 in place. And the other thing I would stress is that there is a system in place to move people out quickly, but it at least gives people an asylum hearing. So it's called expedited removal. If you don't apply for asylum, you can be gone in a matter of hours. If you apply for asylum, it's a very truncated hearing, but at least it's some type of hearing. We think it's too short.
It's a 4-year wait for some right now. There's a historic backlog, as Rosa was reporting.
So there's no
question. To get these hearings.
Well, we're in favor of having a more efficient system, but
Yeah.
the initial screening is very quick. That can be done in a week. And so if you don't have a credible claim, you're gone. It's only people with credible claims that get put into the larger system. Let's reform that larger system.
What should the Biden administration do differently?
Well, I think what we can do is, first of all, put more asylum officers at the border so that it's not this kind of drawn-out procedure. But I think they need to put more resources into it. I think Congress needs to put more resources in. It's all about enforcement now. But these families, I mean, you hear people saying, well, this is a national security crisis. If you would see these families at the border, and I know CNN has been down there all the time, these families walk over the border and they just sit down with their little children wanting to apply for asylum. They're not bringing drugs. They're not a danger. And so let's move some of the enforcement resources into processing cases.